Welcome to the IDB conversation with finance ministries from Latin America and the Caribbean, a discussion with finance ministers on fiscal programs. This is an open to the public event with simultaneous interpretation available in English and Spanish. Bienvenidos al seminario del Departamento de Investigación del BID, conversatorio con ministros de finanzas de América Latina y el Caribe, una discusión en programas fiscales. Este es un evento abierto al público y cuenta con interpretación simultánea en inglés y en español.
This is a virtual meeting with English and Spanish.
Mr. Michael Studd, Latin American editor for the Financial Times, as the moderator. Mr. Studd.
Thank you very much, Mariela, and welcome all of you to this session with finance ministers. We're very fortunate to have 5 finance ministers with us today, representing a real diversity of countries from across the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, from the biggest country, Brazil, to some of the Caribbean nations, some of the English-speaking nations. We've got Central America here represented by Costa Rica, South America. So a really broad spectrum here of countries that can speak to some of the challenges that are facing the region. I would just say by way of introduction that I think it's a particularly difficult time to be a finance minister in Latin America and the Caribbean. So you have my sympathy in that sense. I think it's a time of enormous pressure, obviously post-pandemic, with less fiscal space, with greater social demands, greater demands from the population. So it's harder than ever to make those trade-offs and to balance those different competing pressures. And I think also, of course, on the more positive side, it's a time of enormous opportunity for the region. Those opportunities don't come all the time, but we know them. Nearshoring is a massive opportunity. Renewable energy, Latin America is incredibly well placed. Food exports, critical minerals, a few of the biggest. There are lots of others, but those enormous opportunities, Latin America is extraordinarily well placed to exploit. So there has to be, too, a question for finance ministers. What policies can they put in place? What can they do to make the most of those opportunities? But of course, the problem is we know to make the most of some of those opportunities, you need investment, and investment costs money, investment in education, in infrastructure, in health, but also things that don't cost money, pro-business policies, rule of law, a stable regulatory framework, things that are perhaps no financial cost, but maybe involve some political cost. So we have a huge amount to explore there. That's a few of the sort of pointers. I'm going to invite each of our guests to give a 5-minute introductory remark to talk about their own fiscal programs and some of the challenges they face and how they're facing them. And after those 5 minutes each, we'll then go into a little bit of a discussion. And I'm keen to make it a sort of fairly spontaneous discussion. So I'd ask all of our guests here, our ministers, to feel free to come in and sort of add remarks or to interrupt or to disagree if they wish to. And then we'll end by summing up a little bit with some of the experiences that we've heard from. So I'd like to open first by asking Michael Halkitis, Minister of Finance of the Bahamas, for his opening 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, and good moderator, fellow colleague, ministers of finance and the economy, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Pleasure to be here with you. The Bahamas. A lot of the conversation is about countries' response and bouncing back, if you were, following the COVID-19 pandemic. In the case of the Bahamas, we had a twin crisis in that in September 2019, we experienced a very, very devastating Hurricane Dorian, where there was tremendous destruction of property, loss of life, interruption in the economy. And in the aftermath and as part of the recovery efforts, the government had to offer tremendous and extensive tax benefits to aid in the rebuilding effort. So the engine in that particular part of the country, the engine of the economy, was totally destroyed. And so not only did the government have to expend money in recovery, we also had to give various tax incentives to encourage rebuilding. Less than 6 months later, we began to feel the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which endured for about 2 years. And our economy, being a tourism-based and service-based economy, was tremendously hit because, of course, nobody could travel. And so coming out of the pandemic in late 2021, as we began to emerge and the new political administration was in place in the Bahamas, we looked at what some countries were doing. We know some countries were stimulating the economy, putting money into the economy, the US example, and other countries were undergoing austerity to try and bring their finances back in balance. Our administration enunciated a four-pronged strategy to bring us back into balance and rebuild that fiscal headroom that you need in order to face future crises. And the first one was to concentrate on growing the economy. Secondly, to improve our revenue administration. Thirdly, to cost containment. And the fourth thing was seeking out new sources of revenue. Those of us who have tourism economies are very fortunate that tourism bounced back very strongly. We in the Bahamas experienced double-digit growth rates in our economy in 2021 and 2022, and our economy continues to grow, we think, at a very healthy level, albeit at a level that has reverted back towards the mean over the last 10 years or so. And so in the Bahamas, we have seen, for example, our deficit fall from 13% of GDP in 2021 to 1.3% of GDP last year. Debt to GDP fall from around 100%.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
13% to 1%.
13% to 1.
I think you need to tell Javier Milei about this, because when I saw him in Buenos Aires, he said his fiscal consolidation was the world-beating one, but yours sounds bigger.
Yeah, without the benefit of any sort of restructuring program, I might add. And debt to GDP from around 100 down to the mid-75s, or the mid-70s, and trending downwards. And the main engine, of course, was the growth in the economy and as well the improvement of our revenue administration through increased use of digitization, technology, things like audits, post-clearance audits by the Customs Department. And so we've seen a very, very encouraging and substantial improvement. Where the challenges for us remain is how do we tackle these state-owned enterprises and have them impose that same sort of discipline that we have at the central government level. We've also undertaken a very, very ambitious energy reform program. As with many countries in the Caribbean, the cost of electricity is too high. It's an impediment to doing business, the burden on the home households. And so we are undertaking very, very extensive reform where we are engaging in a reform of the transmission and distribution element of it, and as well in entering power purchase agreements on the generation side. We think that will have a significant impact on our GDP because of the savings that will accrue to businesses, households, and governments. So we're very, very encouraged about that. And so I think I'll stop there and engage with the
thank you.
In the discussion later on. But we're fortunate to see that tourism has rebounded sharp,
right.
And the government has used this sort of crisis as an opportunity to implement some reform.
Thanks, Minister. Well, lots to explore there in the discussion. Y ahora le voy a pedir al ministro de Costa Rica, Nogui Acosta, sus palabras.
And now I'm going to ask the Minister of Costa Rica to give us his first comments, who's going to speak to us in Spanish, the Minister. And we do have translation for those of you who don't speak Spanish. Minister? Thank you. And I think that contrary to many other countries, Costa Rica was able to have a fiscal reform prior to the pandemic, which helped it have a consolidation process of its fiscal situation at the time of the pandemic, which was a great advantage because that rebound was used adequately. And what happens that, as in other countries, and I think that my colleagues here will agree with me, all of us ended up quite indebted. The way in which we dealt with the pandemic was with indebtedness. And that has two consequences. First, we had a debt at a relatively expensive rate, despite the fact that it was a complicated situation. The burden of the payment of interest on the tax income was very high. And I have to say that that's a problem for development. The second question was that I think we have, in the case of Costa Rica, been in debt management process, which I think is the fundamental aspect. From my point of view, fiscal reform is not viable after the pandemic. The people, no one is willing to accept the fiscal reform because the economy has not been fully recovered. There are sectors that have been doing well. As my colleague Michael from Bahamas said, tourism did grow. In the case of Costa Rica, we've also seen a growth in tourism. We're above the level prior to the pandemic, which obviously has resilience capacity in that sector. But there are other sectors that have not had the same type of growth. In the particular group of in Costa Rica, we have a more diversified economy, probably more than other countries. We have a basis which exports, or the main export product is the medical devices. So we're not talking about an economy that is basing its development exclusively on the commodity or raw materials. We are a little more diversified and maybe a little more sophisticated in our export systems. I think that we're going to follow this indebtedness in many of the countries, and the multilateral agencies are going to have to be a little less pro-cyclic and more counter-cyclic, and see how they can help the countries finance the payment of the debt. I think that some have already taken certain steps to drop the rates and the commissions, because the space for us to collect more taxes is really quite limited. I think that for us, the pandemic is going to have a much longer duration than we expected initially. And I think that the work of the finance ministers will have to focus on being very strategic and see how they can strengthen the growth of the economy so that it's based on sounder aspects and not just only the volatile activities. And above all, I think that the sophistication of the tax collection is, in Costa Rica, for example, we have a process of digitalization of all things that have to do with tax collection. We have a single system that is going to manage the collection and all the way up to the provision of goods and subsidies and so forth to Costa Ricans. And I think that there's another fundamental issue. We would need support, especially those of us who are so close to the U.S. and its influence, to maybe take advantage of the opportunities like the CHIPS Act so that we can become part of this development process of knowledge evolving from the way in which we generate our revenues now to sounder ways in the future, so that we can ensure greater resilience of our economies. I think that that's what we've been working with mainly, and where we're going to focus all our efforts in the future. Thank you very much, Minister. And I think that that aspect of the space that still exists for fiscal reforms in collections is fundamental. And I think it's something that all of us are going to talk about during our discussions.
Minister Christopher Coy, if you would like to share your experiences with us from Belize, please, Minister. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the audience, the opportunity to speak to you about Belize's experience and our challenges Our experience has not been dissimilar to my colleagues here. Certainly, the COVID experience did have a significant impact on how we approach our fiscal recovery and our fiscal growth path. Specifically, as opposed to, let's say, what Bahamas had experienced, we were already in a debt crisis leading up to the COVID pandemic. So the COVID pandemic only exacerbated that problem for us. And unfortunately, we also experienced a couple climate events. I think it was ETA and IOTA back in 2020 for us. So everything just mounted on top of each other to put us in a position where we were in a crisis position, fiscal and economic crisis position. That meant for us that in terms of a policy approach, we had to have a immediate term action that we had to take. And then from there, we could look at more medium term and beyond. As far as that immediate action, we had to look immediately at our public finances and our debt position. We had to go through a restructuring process, which we thankfully were successful with by the blue bond transaction, that debt for nature swap. We were able to discount 45% of all our external commercial debt. But alongside that, there were other debt restructurings that were successful. At the time, we had, I believe it was over 133% debt to GDP. We were able to bring that down substantially through those restructurings, and subsequently to now, our debt to GDP is, I think, 62%. But at the very outset, it was a lot to do with debt restructuring.
So you've halved your debt to GDP ratio.
Yes. And in part because of the debt
I think
reduction.
a lot of the finance ministers here would love to do the same thing.
Well,
you have to tell them how you did it.
Well, it's not easy, and it's everybody on board. Everybody on board, especially the private sector. At the outset, I would say the public sector was not on board because we had to make tough decisions to cut wages rather than retrench. We cut wages, and that lasted for a year. We restored wages after a year, and we introduced increments back after the following year for public service. So that helped us to reverse our position in terms of the severe primary deficits we were experiencing and turn those into primary surpluses, which we have maintained over the past 3 years.
You managed to get public sector workers to accept pay cuts without protest?
Put it this way, we had a pandemic. Everybody's working from home if they're working at all. The schools are closed. The teachers can't go to teach. So they could go on strike. But I mean, at this point in time, it was a new administration. We could invest some political capital at that point in time. And by doing that, we were able to turn things around, and more than not, people are happy with where things are now. We have grown since then over 30% in real terms. That's after accounting for inflation. Just this first half of this year, our growth rate continues to outperform. We had a 10% growth rate in the first half of this year. For the full year, we expect around 7%. Besides the debt to GDP and the fiscal surpluses, we are now carrying our unemployment rate has come down to an all-time low. We're at 3% basically for the last 2 years, and inflation has also come down to below 4%, in line with what operates up here. And our foreign exchange reserves are at their highest levels they've ever been. That has been through not only fiscal operations, but also through encouraging private sector investment. The tourism sector has more than rebounded. It's exceeding where it was back in 2019. Every month right now represents a record month for us. But beyond tourism, we've seen the emergence of the BPO sector, the business process outsourcing or nearshoring, whereas we had
you're going through an extraordinary boom, right? Incredibly
we are
boom, what
yes
we're hearing.
we are
It's the
our
Belize economic miracle.
we are
It's
going
amazing.
through I don't know if we want to call it a boom, but we are on an elevated growth path. Going forward, we expect that to slow down, to moderate, but we do expect it to moderate at a higher level than where it was previous to the COVID. Whereas we were on long-term average growth rate around 2%, we're projecting conservatively at 3.4% going forward in real terms. Our goal is to enhance that even more, but we have to look from a structural standpoint and look at Belize as being a part of the region and enhance regional economic integration. That's one, and then energy. A lot of things you mentioned in your intro are what we are looking at. So in terms of the energy part, we see securing energy independence, but also diversifying where through renewable energy we could potentially export energy from Belize into, let's say, Mexico.
But I mean, achieving a sort of long-term growth rate of 3.4% is almost double the regional average.
Yeah,
that's quite impressive.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. We'll come back in more detail in the discussion. And now I'd like to ask Minister Carlos Fernandez from Paraguay. Ministro, no sé si quiere en inglés o español, pero como guste. Bueno, adelante.
Somos grado de inversión.
Okay. How to talk about investment? Well, basically,
ese es el tweet que me tocó hacer un viernes a
that's
las 4 de la tarde.
the tweet that I had to do on a Friday afternoon at 4 in New York, and it had the greatest repercussion since I'm on social media. Very simple, resounding, but it summarizes not only the effort that Paraguay has made during the not only during the last months, but during the past years, because this has been a marathon, a 42-kilometer marathon. I'll do it in Spanish to balance things out a bit, because we have 2 in English, we have 2 in Spanish, and then Portuguese to balance everything. And I thank the department, the Ministry of Finance of Paraguay. So to us, basically this wonderful time that we have, and that we're spending now in Washington, hopefully with not so many clouds as we have in the region. Yesterday we were talking about Rodrigo Valdez from the IMF, and among one of the things that he mentioned was what the message, his message will be in Rio. And there were 2 things. First, there's the need to rebalance the policies, in which most of the countries, the monetary policy is still very contractive and the fiscal policy very expansive. So we had to rebalance that. And I asked, well, what's new with that? Because for over a year now, we've been in that rebalancing process. And in fact, almost immediately after 2020, we have the pathway towards the fiscal adjustment, which will lead to 1.5% of the GDP for 2026. And therefore, the adjustment and central bank, thanks to its rapid actions and especially effective, although some people say that we have a high level of dollarization, we're able to bring inflation down to the target, and they normalized the rate for the fiscal policy. So in a certain way, Paraguay is a step ahead of the message that the IMF is going to launch and share in Rio. So from here on, what is our vision? Our vision is obviously to guarantee this, which is to reach fiscal consolidation. And in the meantime, I forgot to mention the other message in Rio, which is that the countries need to do structural reforms. And there, I was telling Rodrigo, I'm being accused of stepping over the Congress because of all the reforms that we have passed in this short period of time. If you ask me for more, I'm going to get kicked out because in Paraguay we've implemented a series of structural implementations that seeks to have a more efficient public sector. And this is the way that we can maintain this growth, and I think that it's characterized as, and according to the IMF and the World Bank, ours is the economy that's going to grow the most this year. So still we're happy, but we're not satisfied. We believe that we can do more. We need to continue to delve into these reforms that are going to have a medium-term impact, but we cannot leave aside the social part. So the results of one of the key reforms that we've implemented, which has been the consolidation of two collections agencies that were previously independent and that have allowed us to have collections with tax collections growth of 20%. 20% with an inflation of 4, not 100% with an inflation of 120. So that has been fundamental to have new resources and to, at a short term, dedicate things that are going to be important now and tomorrow: health, education, security, and social transfer. These are $860 million more that we have for 2025, and almost 92% of that has been dedicated to these 4 factors that I've mentioned. So from now on, or from here on, the public sector will be consolidated and it will do what it has to do. And finally, from what I've seen here, and without the intention of bothering Elon or Felipe Jaramillo in the meetings that I had with him, this is one of the important meetings I'm going to have this week. And I said, okay, here I have 2 meetings, which are the most important ones. And those are the meetings with IDB Invest and IS. Why? Because we believe that we are working so that it could be the private sector that could actually be the engine, the motor of growth, and for it to be the leader of economic growth in the country. And for that, it's going to need financing from multilaterals. And so far, they've been very shy with the private sector of Paraguay. And I came here practically with the sole mission of saying, please visit us, go out to the field, and please discover all the opportunities that the private sector has in our country. Perfect. Thank you very much, Minister.
And then we left the biggest for last, Brazil. So, Ministro, você poderia falar em português se quiser, ou se não, pode falar em inglês como você gostar. Não tem problema.
I can try to do it in English. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, ministers here. I'm the deputy minister for Brazil. Minister Haddad is in another meeting asking me to come here and speak on his behalf. So first of all, thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity. I think Brazil, as the other ministers have mentioned, is living a kind of similar situation. The first thing that we have mentioned here in our meetings in Washington this week is that the fiscal challenge that we have in the country is not new. So Brazil, since 2014, is living a very hard fiscal challenge. And of course, with the previous government, it was a disaster, and we had a pandemic during the government. And what we received in 2023, last year, was the same level of spending, of expenditures in relation to the GDP, around 19% of the GDP. But we received a revenue around 17% of the GDP. So there is a gap of 2% of Brazil GDP when you compare expenditures and revenues. And of course, with Lula and Haddad, it is impossible and it's not feasible to ask for an adjustment for austerity measures that would affect the poor people, that would affect the labor rights or things like that. So what we have, what Haddad especially have managed to do is to work with smart austerity. So, of course, fiscal stability is important. Of course, consolidation of the fiscal agenda is very important. We have been saying that over and over since day one. But the challenge is not just to have the fiscal in place, but at the same time, not to suffocate the growing of the country, and at the same time look to the social needs and to the environmental needs. In Brazil, as the other countries here, we need to deal with the climate change impact, and we are suffering a lot this year, especially with the Rio Grande do Sul flood, and also with the seca in Pantanal and other areas in the country. So we need to deal with a lot of plates in our hands at the same time, pushing in different directions. But now, close to 2 years after this third Lula's mandate, I think we are managing very successfully at least the majority of the challenge that we have. Last year, we approved more than 10 bills in Congress, putting light in the inequalities that we have in the fiscal agenda in Brazil. There's a lot of benefits in Brazil that were not related to climate change agenda, that were not related to efficiency in economic results. There were benefits related to the past of the country, to few companies that were using that benefits with no social outcomes or no duly outcomes as we expected. So we were able to mobilize public opinion and to approve in Congress more than 10 bills that are reflecting this year in a revenue that's growing more than 10% real, discounting inflation. So it's a huge impact that we are having in Brazil, and by the end of this year, we are going to be able to close the gap. We are getting to 18.5% of revenues in relation to the GDP, and we are bringing down the expenditure level under 19%. So this is one thing that I think it's wonderful, and I myself was very in doubt of.
There's a lot of market concern, isn't there?
Are we going to
Brazil's
have the power?
ability to rein in deficits? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a continual worry in Brazil, is that the very high levels of deficit. You think that's really under control now?
I think in this year, by the end of the year, we are going to close that gap, that 2% gap that we inherited in 2023. We are going to close that. Of course, we still have challenge. Yesterday, I was in a meeting, and people were saying, we are in a crucial fiscal moment in Brazil. This is the time. And I said, if we meet 2 months from now, we are going to be saying the same thing. We are in a crucial fiscal moment in Brazil. So,
or in 2 years,
or in 2 years. So we are dealing with that challenge. But I think we are managing to do that. Brazil is growing much more than the private sector was expecting and projecting. So last year we grew 2.9%. Market was expecting 1%, 0.8%, and this year we are projecting 3.2% in government, but some private sector analysts are saying 3.3 or 3.5%. When in the beginning of the year there was the expectation that we were growing. We were going to grow about 2% or 1.8%. So we are.
And how much of that higher growth is government spending driven, and how much is private sector driven, do you think?
We have both elements here. So we have some of governments increasing in expenditures, not just at the federal level. We had elections in cities in Brazil just now, and we have seen some growing in expenditures on the local levels in 2024. On the federal level, we grew more our expenditures last year because we had the transition from Bolsonaro to Lula, and that was traumatic to the country. So we had camps in front of army headquarters. We have truck drivers blocking hundreds of highways in Brazil. We have people invading Congress and tearing apart the Supreme Court. So in the middle of that, we were planning a way out from an economic agenda. in order for us, so what we have seen from 2014 to 2023 is a country which is living a huge polarization process from a political perspective, and also a fiscal crisis. So it's 10 years of really instability in the country. And I think what we have done now, it's not over. I think we don't have the job all done, but we are trying to consolidate some regularity in Brazil from an institution point of view. So Supreme Court, Congress, and the federal government, we are talking, we are engaging, we have a clear agenda to move forward, and I think we are building a very important path going forward. Just one thing that for us is really important is beyond the fiscal challenge that we still have to do more on both sides. We need more revenues, and we need to cut to do spending review, to cut expenditures. We believe that's really important to have a development strategy. And what we are doing here also is to launch a green investment platform that Haddad just did today at 9 a.m. With a lot of partners. We have done the Eco Invest platform. It's a new policy in Brazil that we are doing monetary insurance, we could say like that, for long-term investments in green projects. So I think we are moving both directions, taking care of the fiscal and looking for the development agenda.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Minister. So now we're going to move to the sort of question and conversation part. I'd like to make it a bit of a conversation, so do feel free, all of you, to sort of jump in where you want to. And I thought we could start on the tax reform. Several of you have mentioned the need for tax reform, the need for revenues. It was interesting too that Minister Acosta said he thought that the people were not ready to take more tax rises at this point. And I in that regard, I was thinking the World Bank put out an interesting paper earlier this month where they said, well, couldn't we do something on property taxes in Latin America? And they pointed out that property taxes are very low by global standards in Latin America on the whole, that they're very hard to avoid because you can't move a property. And they suggested perhaps this was a way that governments in the region could raise more money with relatively low effort and with a relatively high degree of popular acceptance. So I just wanted to put that one on the table, really, and see who'd like to come in, who'd like to comment on that, and whether you think there are other tax reforms that might be worthwhile or necessary. You'd like to start?
I can start going the other way around here now. So I think in Brazil we have three tax reforms. When we talk about tax reforms in Brazil, we're talking about the consumer tax reform. So the IVA or the the VAT reform. So Brazil is one of the worst, has one of the worst consumer tax systems. It's an awful system, we agree with that. So we are we have approved the constitutional amendment, and now we are working to approve the regulation, the ordinary laws. And it's a huge, huge reform on consumer taxation in Brazil. It's going to be much more rational than it is today, starting 2026 in the federal level. I think the second one is the income tax reform. We are going to propose to Congress this year, still probably by the end of November, a new approach to income tax. So in Brazil, we have the lower class pays few income tax, and the majority of the population pays around 18, 17, 20% of income tax. And then we have the richest people in Brazil. They also don't pay taxes. And leaning on
dividends are free of tax, aren't they, in Brazil?
Yeah, dividends are free of tax.
I think it's the only country in the world that doesn't tax dividends, right? Which is remarkable.
But we need to change that. This is the point. So when we look to the richest people in Brazil, we're not saying that they need to pay more than 20%. No, we are saying that they need to pay a minimum. So if the workers and myself and everyone in Brazil pays at least 15% of income tax, most rich people in Brazil should pay at least 10% of it. This is a matter of justice. And in relation to the property tax in Brazil, it's of competence of the cities and states. So it has little to do with the federal government.
Thank you. Who else would like to comment on the taxation?
Voy.
Ministro.
El 16 de agosto, después de asumir el 2023,
On
nosotros
August 17th, after taking office in 2023, we had a meeting with approximately 1,200 entrepreneurs that had come for President Peña's ceremony. And I received almost a standing ovation when I said, this government will not raise taxes. But we still think this way. And I'm going to give you an idea of why I think it's a very bad idea to increase taxes. We have a story. This whole story started in 2002 when the corporate tax was 30%. What was collected? 30% of the GDP. So nothing was collected, absolutely anything. And in spite of the opposition, finally the entrepreneurs were able to convince the politicians that this was a very good idea, which was to lower corporate taxes from 30 to 10%. And at the same time, a personal income tax of 10% was established with a 10% VAT also. So we have the famous trilogy, 10, 10, 10. Thanks to that, we've been able to collect around 8% of the GDP, and it started to increase to around 10. And now with the reform, it's at 11.1% of the GDP. As I said before, $850 million. Paraguay is a Mediterranean country, and its taxes are not low. They are competitive. Here we have to see what we're going to do, not only to collect more, for which we need to be smart, we need to be intelligent, but as was said, and I always repeat, the work of the GDP, how to spend better, that's just as important as collecting more. And how to collect more, I've been listening, paying close attention to what was said. People asked, how did you increase 1.1% of the GDP in tax pressure with the same taxes? First, honesty. Second, technology. The intense use of technology and crossing of information were fundamental to have that 1.1%, that additional 1.1%. Two separate entities where each one of them was the owner of the whole situation was not working. The information was not shared. And by having one owner allows us to share information. That way we were able to capture many of those taxes that were being lost. But it's not just a matter of collecting more. It's also a matter of spending better. And I think that's where in all the countries of the region, we have to make a great effort to spend better. Tender or bidding processes where public calls are made. For example, a glass costs $1 in one place, $1.50 in another, and that's unacceptable. So we passed a new law for public tender where we can make joint calls, but it's not enough. And I think that, Michael, more than simply speculating and thinking that an income tax is or property tax is going to be the solution, it's not. First, if we don't let the private sector work and therefore generate more jobs and pay more taxes, things aren't going to work.
We also took the view coming out of the pandemic that we did not want to increase taxes. Most of our taxes come from a VAT, and as well as various business license tax and some other there's taxes on property. Given the fact that we import the vast majority of what we produce, we experience the imported inflation that everybody experienced. So the government took the position we're not going to put increase taxes, which would only add to the cost of living. As a matter of fact, we dropped the rate of VAT from 12% to 10%. We decided to concentrate on administration. We're an archipelago, so our country is dispersed over, over 100,000 square miles of ocean. We realized that there was a lot of leakage in terms of taxes within the local economies, mostly driven by tourism, things like boating and yachting, as well as individuals who come in and establish Airbnbs that are not, have not been caught within the tax net, so to speak. And so we decided that we would focus on improving our administration, which has yielded some results. In terms of the property tax, we have what we believe, you probably agree with the World Bank's report, a very, very generous property tax regime with low tax rates, some exemptions, a lot of exemptions particularly for residents. We believe we have to maintain that to offset some of the other high costs of housing and home ownership. So we have incentives for first-time homeowners, for example, in terms of no taxes on first-time homeowners. You have a very high threshold. If your home is valued $300,000 or less, there's no property tax for that. And so, but we believe that that's part of the program to help to insulate the population from just the rising cost of living. We think there's a lot of work left to be done in terms of tax administration. Some of the larger corporations and big businesses are, as you know, very expert and creative at managing their tax obligation. And so, we continue to work on that. But again, as my colleague from Paraguay said, we balance all of this tax policy, how hard you go at collection, with making sure you don't suffocate the economy and the economy can still grow.
And stay competitive.
Exactly.
Yeah, because the region also has quite high corporate taxes. Minister, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. I would say that we don't look at the budget, the parts of the budget in isolation. We look at what our policies, our development goals, and social policies that we want to support. In particular, for example, education that move towards free education, especially in secondary schools. We don't have free education in secondary schools, so we are on a path to enabling and providing free education in secondary schools, and we're on a path almost there to having universal primary health care for the whole country, and supposed to achieve that by next year. Beyond that, then you have infrastructure and, of course, investments for climate resiliency. And as we look at that host of capital and recurrent expenditures, that impacts on how we look at our tax policy. For sure, we have comprehensive tax reform that we're looking at, but in terms of any additional taxation, we try and refrain from doing that to the extent that we don't need to, and that we can enhance our tax collections by incentivizing growth in the economy, generating more taxes through growing the economy, but also in improving tax compliance and enforcement of tax collection. So our tax regime is relatively simple, but we look at how we can modernize it through digitization efforts, including, for example, on the general sales tax or the consumption tax side. We're about to complete the implementation of electronic invoicing. In terms of tax administration, we seek to empower the tax department with the issuance of administrative penalties rather than having to go through a full court process, so that the impact is more immediate and enhances tax compliance. We are at this point in time actually looking at creating a semi-autonomous revenue authority, so completely separating that, giving some level of autonomy but more independence in terms of the EHR. That seems to be a bottleneck in terms of having effective tax officers ensuring tax compliance.
Thank you. Ministro Acosta, ¿quiere profundizar algo en el tema de reforma tributaria? Y sobre
Minister
todo,
Acosta, would you like to add anything on tax reforms and the possibility of imposing more taxes in Costa Rica? Yes, I think that first of all, I could say that Carlos should be the minister or the only minister of finances that is loved in Latin America, because we all talk about taxes and he doesn't talk about that. So the second thing that I want to say
is that much of the development expectation of the countries has to do with the financing. Costa Rica has a significant gap between the expenditure and its tax revenue, and something that we have to resolve, and quickly, because much of the Costa Rican development is education, health, and significant economic growth. We have a universal health system which is based on forms, and it's not sustainable. We have an education system demanding that it be free and mandatory, initially for primary care and then for secondary care and now for preschool. And that has a very high cost because it's financed practically all by the state. If we remove the interest and amortization, it takes about 40% of the budget, and the collections are relatively small. So I think that
va en dos direcciones, cómo recaudamos más y cómo somos más efectivos. En el tema de la propiedad, al igual que Brasil y Paraguay, el impuesto a la propiedad lo cobran las municipalidades, o sea, los alcaldes, etcétera. Y entonces ahí no hay un impacto desde el punto de vista de Hacienda. Lo que sí creemos es que tenemos que avanzar, por lo menos en el caso de Costa Rica, que tenemos un sistema tributario cedular y además territorial, avanzar a esquemas más modernos. Siendo Costa Rica parte de OCDE, necesita avanzar en un proceso de modernización del marco tributario sobre el cual trabaja. Y ahí yo creo que hay dos retos importantes. El primero es cómo podemos explicarle a la aprobación la necesidad de la reforma. Voy a decirles que cuando nosotros terminamos el acuerdo con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, diseñamos una propuesta de reforma tributaria que tenía un impacto neutral desde el punto de vista de la recaudación de gobierno. Lo que hacía era equilibrar un poco las cargas tributarias, y sin embargo, la posición del Congreso fue no más impuestos, porque resulta que aumentábamos el mínimo exento para los trabajadores independientes y uniformábamos la tasa para las empresas. Eliminamos una diferencia que existe entre pequeñas.
We normalized it for the others. So we made a difference between the small, medium, and large, and that set aside all the possibilities of the reform. And I can tell you that those companies that hope to improve their educational system or their health systems, with the current tax system that we have now, it's impossible. And I think that that's one of the big challenges for Costa Rica. And it includes three elements. It has to generate the necessary growth to improve opportunities for personal development, creating the necessary conditions to reduce some of the exemptions. Many of our countries have
puesto exoneraciones para incentivar algunas actividades
exempts for certain activities, and as all exempts, it has to have a time limit, and it has to have evaluation of its impact from the point of view of the tax expenditure. And I think that the main challenge is going to be to have a fairer system where all activities should contribute to the country's development. Yes, I agree. Thank you very much, Minister, for your comments.
And if we think we've been having a bit of a discussion about squaring circles, which is the lot of a finance minister. If we think about one of the things that might help us square a circle, it might be greater regional integration. No, it's often observed that Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the regions of the world that trades least with itself, and that there's potential here for improving that substantially, and that could be a major growth driver. And we've got with us here countries who are part of CAFTA-DR, Costa Rica. We've got CARICOM here as well, and we've got Mercosur. So we've got three of the sort of big trade blocks of the region represented in this panel. So I thought it would be interesting to ask the ministers here what potential they see for improving regional integration, but above all, how it could happen in a concrete way, because it's a wonderful sort of lofty aspiration. Everyone can agree it's a good idea, but how do you actually make this happen? So I don't know who'd like to start here. Maybe Minister Fernandez, no, from the Mercosur perspective. Adelante, ministro.
Nuestra visión de integración es algo
A vision of integration
que la vemos
is
como algo muy positivo y muy
something we see
necesario,
as something
principalmente para un
positive and
pequeño
necessary, especially
país
for
pequeño y
a
abierto como
small and open
el
country
Paraguay.
like Paraguay.
Y cierto, hay muchas
And
cosas
true,
por
there are
mejorar incluso
many things to
dentro de
improve,
Mercosur,
even within Mercosur.
pero
But
nosotros lo evaluamos en términos
we
positivos. De
evaluate it
hecho, algo
in
que uno de
positive
los
terms. In
principales
fact, one of the
motores de
main
crecimiento y de la
growth
recuperación
motors
ahora, que es
is
la parte de
exports,
maquila, no
which
hubiese
is
sido
of the
posible
maquila,
sin
which would
un
not have been
Mercosur,
possible had we not had
totalmente el acuerdo de integración.
Mercosur and the agreement with
Entonces,
Brazil.
de nuevo,
So
también estamos
again,
contentos, pero no
we are
satisfechos.
happy, but not satisfied.
Quisiéramos ver más
And we'd
integración
like
de
to see
Mercosur con
greater
cualquier
Mercosur
área del
integration
mundo,
with
no
any areas of
solamente
the world, not
regionalmente.
just
Ahora,
regionally.
viendo la región
Now, if we
Sudamérica,
see the region of South
básicamente
America,
tenemos una línea que
basically
va de
we have
norte a
one
sur,
line that goes
donde somos
north-south,
economías
where
totalmente
we have
diferentes. De un lado,
completely
mucho
different
más
economies.
agrícola,
On the
mucho
one side,
más
much more agriculture,
ganadera, y del otro lado,
much more
más
cattle
basado en la
raising. On
parte
the other
mineral.
side, more minerals.
Entonces, son
So
perfectamente complementarias.
perfectly
Y
complementary,
complementariedad
and they complement
significa
each other, which
posibilidades de
means there
integración.
is a possibility of integration.
Lastimosamente parece que somos muy
Unfortunately, it would
miopes y
seem
no
as though
estamos
we're
viendo de que somos
myopic,
perfectamente
and we
compatibles.
don't see how compatible we can
Y tal
be.
vez uno de los grandes
And maybe
problemas
one
que
of the
tenemos
big
es
problems
de
that we
que
have
tenemos
is
problemas
that
de
we
conectividad.
have
Yo creo que la parte
connectivity
logística
problems. I
es
think
uno de
that
los
the
principales
logistics is
obstáculos que
probably one of
tenemos
the
ahora
main
en
obstacles
Sudamérica,
that we face in Latin
como para
America right now,
mirar un poco más hacia
so
nuestro
that we could
costado y no
maybe
tan
look to
lejos.
the other side
A
and not
veces es
so
mucho más fácil
far
llevar
out.
nuestro
Sometimes it's
producto tan
easier to
lejos
take
como
our
China,
product
en
as
lugar
far
de
out as
llegar a
China
algo mucho más
instead of
cercano como puede ser Brasil.
bring them to something as close as Brazil.
Entonces,
So
integración
integration
vista positiva,
seen
pero creo que tenemos mucho
positively,
por trabajar
but I
también
think
en
we have to
términos
work
de
a lot there
integración
to
física.
achieve
Ojalá que
what would be the
este
physical
sueño que
integration.
tenemos
Hopefully, this
de la
dream
vía
that we
oceánica
have
que va a venir desde
of the
Brasil
oceanic
y
path
va a
from
ir desde el
Brazil,
Atlántico hasta
from
el
the
Pacífico
Atlantic to the
sea una
Pacific,
realidad y
will
permita
become a
también
reality
ser
and would
progreso.
also
Bueno, lo
give us a
están
chance.
construyendo, ¿no? En
But
este
I think they're
momento.
building it
Como
right
ves de
now, are they
Paraguay.
not?
Hay una parte que me
Well, there
preocupa, que
is
es la
one thing that
parte
concerns me, and
argentina,
that's
te voy
the
a ser franco,
section in
porque
Argentina. I have
ellos
to
con
be
su política
honest because
tienen
with
cero
their policies,
inversión,
they have
cero
zero
inversión.
zero investment
Entonces,
right now.
básicamente vamos a
So
tener
we're going
una
to
super
have
avenida
a
viniendo del puerto de
huge
Santos y
avenue
va a
that's going to go
terminar
from
justo ahí
Santo
antes de cruzar el
and it's
puente
going to
con
stop
Argentina.
before it
Creo que
crosses
no
to
nos va a
Argentina.
servir.
And I think
Ojalá
that's going to be
que
useless.
tengamos ese
Hopefully,
espíritu integracionista
there
que
will be the
tuvo
integrationist spirit
Simón Bolívar o San
of Simón
Martín,
Bolívar or
¿verdad?
San
Y
Martín,
finalmente tengamos
and finally we
materializado este sueño de
turn
una
this
Sudamérica.
dream into a
Who
reality
else would like to come
of
in
an
on
integrated
regional
South America.
integration? Would you like to, Minister Coy?
Yes, thank you. From my intro on our fiscal programs, one of the things I highlighted was how do we elevate our growth path? And certainly we see regional integration as one of the key elements to enable that. We've been working very hard on that from the onset of this administration. Our Prime Minister has focused in on our neighbors. We have a well-established relationship with CARICOM, but you're right, the trade between ourselves and CARICOM is a lot lower than trade with our neighbors, even without any integration efforts. I think we're roughly 10%, less than 5% of imports come from CARICOM. We do export quite a bit more in terms of percentage, but in terms of active trade, a lot of our trade is with North America, Mexico, and Central America. So our Prime Minister made a concerted effort to enhance these trade relationship or access to markets. We're working on a partial scope agreement with Mexico, hoping to finalize that in the near future. We've pretty much concluded a partial scope agreement with Salvador, and we are in the process of expanding our partial scope agreement with Guatemala. But beyond that, we also see the opportunity for Belize to be an alternative logistics route between Central America and southern Mexico. It would cut off easily over 400 kilometers just to do that. And we are actually working with the IDB to bring that to fruition. So I believe a feasibility study will be initiated and signed off tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And then beyond that, the American El Centro initiative, under which we are pushing or advocating for this integration effort, will certainly help to support that objective.
Thank you. And I think Minister Durigan would like to come in. You have to tell us also how we're going to stop this Bioceanica from ending in the middle of Argentina and make sure it actually gets to Chile.
So just to be for President Lula's instance and Minister Haddad on the regional integration is historically very pro of the integration. So Lula and a lot of his allies in the 1988 Constitution added to the Article 4 of Brazilian Constitution the main goals of the Republic of Brazil. One of that is the regional integration. So it's a long flag, as we say, that Lula is supporting. So from a more concrete perspective, I think we have first of all to protect Mercosul and keep Mercosul strong and growing and integrating itself. I think it's one of the good and positive experiences that we have in terms of integration. And with Bolsonaro, especially in Brazil, we lost a lot of the efforts and the dynamic that we had with the other countries. For example, the Minister of Agriculture in Brazil was telling me that since day one of 2023 last year, he and Lula opened to the Brazilian agriculture commerce more than 190 countries in comparison to what Bolsonaro left. So 190 countries more today buy meat from Brazil, buy our seeds and our agricultural production. So it's a huge difference in terms of international presence. We are discussing with the Ministra Simone, who will also be here in the IBD today, the routes of integration in South America. We are discussing 6 routes, not only through Argentina, but through all the other countries, in order for us to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, going through strategic points inside the countries. We have discussed Minister Haddad and Gabriel, who will be the new central bank governor in Brazil, monetary integration in the region. And I would like to highlight the brand new things that we are launching in Brazil. It's the climate change mechanisms that we will, of course, we want that, and we will need to share with the region. So we are working with the World Bank to have a TFF, the Tropical Forest Fund Forever. It's a mechanism that we are expecting to leverage a lot of international funds in order to protect the Amazon. The Amazon is not just Brazil. So the Amazon is of course, it's not just the region itself. It's not a property of the region. It's a global property. So I think monetary integration, physical integration, as was said before, with the routes, not only through Argentina, protecting Mercosul, and also enhancing these climate change mechanisms.
Thanks. And that comment on climate change, I think, is a good segue into maybe the last thing we touch before we wrap up, which is to go in a little bit more to climate change and the challenge that represents for finance ministers in the region, a region, Latin America, which is very severely affected by climate change. Ministro Acosta, creo que quisiera comentarnos algo sobre el tema del cambio climático.
Sí, precisamente.
Yes, I think that one of the topics we've set aside is our understanding that the climate change has an impact from a fiscal point of view. Central American countries are quite vulnerable to climate change, and that has implications from the point of view of the cost of the infrastructure as well as the social impact these situations have. Things that are not within our field. As a country, we've made a significant effort to identify fiscal risks and the cost of these contingent liabilities, because one way or another, the state ends up having to assume those risks. And in that respect, I believe that to add that to our budgets or to witness the vulnerability that we have as countries is something very important. And it is so because there are mechanisms to transfer risk. And I think that the specialized insurance companies and the multilateral agencies must have mechanisms that would help our countries deal with these things. I think that there are choices we could make or could evaluate at least, and not just credits that already exist, like the KTDOs, for example, in the case of the World Bank, that are very important because they're triggered when the emergency arises. But there are other relief issues that we should begin to evaluate, like our conversations on the possibility of having time spaces where we're not paying for the credit while we're in an emergency, and then maybe capitalize it going forward. But I think that this is a debate that we have to have. And we not only have to have it at the countries themselves in order to identify the possible risks, but also at the level of the multilaterals, who are probably one of the most important mechanisms to transfer the risk. Many of our countries are facing such situations that would make important sectors of population fall into poverty. And we're not just talking about floods in Central America. We're talking about droughts and migration and all its repercussions, who are going to end up in a weak fiscal situation. I think that from a practical point of view, we have to be as transparent as possible to see it and work with it, because I think that in that, the countries individually are not going to be able to do it alone without the help of the multilaterals. And I think that that is something that we have to discuss here and in many other panels.
And I think it'd be good if Minister Halkitis could share with us a little bit something from the Bahamas perspective on that, which is a country very affected by climate change.
Yes, I say when I spoke earlier, I said we were optimistic and we felt that we were on a good track. I always add to that we are cautiously optimistic about our projections, because any year you can have a devastating hurricane that just blows up the plans of any finance minister. Through the help of the IDB, we have arranged contingent financing. We have a $100 million line for catastrophe. We have another 100 for pandemic. And so that gives us some comfort that, should we be hit by our main threat is hurricanes. Should we be hit by a hurricane, we will have access to funds in a speedy manner to help us to clean up and to begin to restore.
100 million is not a lot, is it?
It's not a lot, but it's a very good start, because otherwise you would have to go through the process of applying for funds. And, it's always good to be able to get in right away, clean up and bring relief and establish some sense of normalcy. Another thing that concerns us, I'll end on this point, is the whole issue of insurance. Because
catastrophe bonds, catastrophe clauses, all those things.
Yeah, we have exploring that. We have those in the works. The other point is that with the increased frequency of climate events, it's difficult to get reinsurance. It might be impossible, and so that affects the economy, because if an investor faces the prospect of not being able to insure his property, then that goes into his calculation. So it's a very we're talking about resilience, moving more to renewables, diversifying the economy in terms of even geographically spreading out the economic activity. But it's something, of course, we have to be aware of, because we're right in Hurricane Alley, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're sort of almost out of time. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask each of our ministers very briefly, in just 1 minute, to share with us a piece of advice or a learning that they've had in the job which they think might be relevant to a broader audience. Could be anything at all from your experience in the job that you'd like to share, I say either as advice or a learning. So just as a way of wrapping up, maybe with 1 minute each, just very briefly. So Minister Durigan, if you'd like to start.
That's a very good question for us to close the panel. So I think the challenge for me and the difficulty that I'm struggling to deal with on a daily basis is how to, at the same time, keep the Workers' Party and the leftists compromise with the social benefits with the poor in Brazil, and at the same time take care of the fiscal and look to the world agenda of the green transaction. I think this is the challenge that we are living. It's the challenge of my generation in the country, and that's what we are there to do.
Thank you. Minister Fernandez, your bit of advice or your learning?
Creo que el trabajo que tenemos.
I think that the work that we have is not easy.
A veces me piden todavía
And I want, sometimes I'm still asked for a selfie, so that makes me happy. So, but many times we can be crowned with good economic growth, with a good inflation number, with a good number of fiscal deficit or surplus. But we shouldn't only think about that so that it could be part of a publication by the IDB or the World Bank or the IMF, or to even be so that this will help us in the rating by insurance companies. But it's how we reach people. That's important. Without that, we'll fail. We can't be happy if those wonderful numbers that we can have don't actually have a positive impact on the well-being of all our compatriots. Wonderful point. Thank you. Minister.
Much advice to give. What I would say is I would encourage a continued call to advocacy as it relates to climate change. It certainly can be depressing in the sense that the advocacy that has been undertaken for so many years, the results that it has yielded is far less than what we need. When it comes to climate change, vulnerable countries like Belize, like our Latin American and Caribbean colleagues, we have outsized needs, Herculean challenges as it relates to building climate resiliency. And yet we are unsuccessful. We remain unsuccessful in getting action, tangible action, material movement to attracting the climate finance on an affordable basis, but on a timely basis for us to really build climate resilience. So I press for a continued call for advocacy.
Call to action on climate change. Ministro Acosta, su consejo.
Minister Acosta, your advice. I think that as our colleague from Brazil said, we have to establish a very careful balance between short, medium, and long term. A Minister of Finance has to think about short, medium, and long terms and establish anchors that will allow them to make decisions on behalf of the people. Sometimes we have to understand that today's bread is tomorrow's hunger. And that's something that a Minister of Finance has to be very clear on. And through our agreement with the IMF, we have a medium-term fiscal plan that calibrates what the pathway that we have to follow is. And I think that the important advice for the ministers of finance, particularly those that have short periods, is that they should set the basis for the development of society and not the needs of the immediate needs of the government. We have to have that balance. And I think that that's the only advice that one could give to ensure that the development of the countries is based on that and not on the needs of the government that's in office. Thank you very much, Minister.
From Bahamas, your piece of advice.
Yes, I endorse what my colleagues have said about being looking at the short, medium, and long term and the importance of balance. But as well, what I would add is the importance of communicating what you're doing to the public and
Talking to journalists.
talking to journalists, talking to members of the public. Keeping the private sector engaged in what you're doing, because in the absence of that information, then people draw their own conclusions. So it's very, very important to share your plans, your successes with the population, and make that connection as to why it's important what you're doing in terms of fiscal management and how that impacts what we call, the man or woman on the street. Make that connection and get that buy-in.
Thank you. No, so a great range of advice there. So I'd just like, really in conclusion, to thank all the ministers here. I mean, they are, I think we'd all agree, facing extraordinary challenges in very difficult times, but we've had a fantastic selection here of insights and experiences shared, which I hope has been valuable for all of you in the audience. I've certainly enjoyed it very much. And also our thanks and gratitude to the IDB and its research department, Chief Economist Eric Parado here in the front row for organizing the event and sponsoring it, and for getting such a great group of finance ministers here together. So thank you all very much in the audience for coming too. Thank you, ministers, for attending. And let's do it again. Thank you.